great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chandrika Sepali Kottegoda, whom we all call Sepali, so you'll often hear me saying that. Essentially, so that she doesn't get confused with Chandrika Kumaratunga, the President of Sri Lanka, whom we do not love and admire as much as we do Sepali, and whom I certainly do not know. As with Uma and Sharmila, Sepali and myself also go back a long way, which is, except for Sharmila dating me as I go along, but Sepali is much younger than many of us. But I go back a long way with her, as I do with many Sri Lankan friends who have always supported me as a friend and person, ASR and the Institute. Indeed, when we as South Asian feminists for many years were discussing how to start the Institute and where we should start it, it was another Sri Lankan, Radhika Kumaraswamy, the UN Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who said we should go ahead and that we must set it up in Lahore. In fact, Sri Lankan friends support me and support us so much that I have often wondered if I would win an election if I stood from them. Sepali has a wonderful sense of humor, and if it weren't so politically incorrect, I would share some of her jokes. But I hope that many of you will get to know her through her association with the Institute and get a chance to laugh with her, since for her humor is very much a part of her activism and her academics. Sepali has an MPhil and a DPhil in Development Studies from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. She is a senior lecturer and examiner in Women and Ideology on the MA in Women's Studies, University of Colombo, and joint coordinator at the Women in Media Collective, also in Colombo. She specializes in gender and development, women in the urban and informal sector, and women in credit management. Her publications include Women's Rights as Human Rights, Notes on Current Debates, Empowerment and Development, in Options, October 1996, published by the Women in Media Collective, and Finding the Household, Some Experiences from Sri Lanka, published in the Economic Review, March 1995. There's a slight change in the topic on which she is to speak. Earlier we were talking about the changing roles of Sri Lankan women in the context of globalization and ethnic conflict, but Sepali will be talking about economic participation of women and female-headed households in situations of armed conflict, perspectives from Sri Lanka. I hope that given our own present situation of armed conflict and our history from 47, that many of those things will not only be familiar, but we hope that it will raise questions and that we will have a lively debate. Sepali.
Well, actually, Mani is one person who has made me stand at these kinds of podiums. I had to do it last time when I came, and she's getting me to do it this time. I generally try to avoid standing here because of this precise reason. Okay, I'm going to actually talk about the economic aspects of women in Sri Lanka, and then I will talk about households, women in households in situations of armed conflict, because I want it to be seen as the different perspectives of the same country, different areas where women face special problems. The ethos of post-independent Sri Lanka has been that of a new nation set on the path of development. Initially understood by the Western world and exemplified by the policies and programs supported by the United Nations as that of economic development, development was readily accepted by the post-independence administration, which took over political power in Ceylon in 1948. With a growing understanding in the West that the post-colonial nations were less affluent than they, and the realization that though politically independent, these nations had boundless sources of labor and resources to be disposed of, the notion of economic development was readily accepted by both the ex-colonizers and most of the newly decolonized countries. The experience of the first few decades of the post-colonial development process showed the inadequacies of the economic growth development paradigm. Parameters were therefore elaborated to define its development to be that of social and economic development. Promotion of policies for the provision of basic needs such as health and education were formulated and implemented around the world. In the 1970s, the UN came out with the principle of a unified approach to development, which called for cross-sectoral and regional integration and for participatory development. Sri Lanka was particularly fortunate in that social welfare policies, even before independence, had already ensured opportunities for both men and women in areas such as education and health services, provided free and made readily available and accessible by the state. The utilization of these services had resulted in an increase in the level of education and health status of women by the 1970s. These social development indicators are found to be significantly high when compared to other South Asian countries. Now, in the global scene, the focus of development shifted once more in the 1980s with the vision that economies, especially in the former colonies, must undergo structural adjustments. These adjustments translated into the dismantling of major welfare facilities such as state health care and education systems, as these were deemed to be expenditures which these nations were not equipped to maintain. Labor-intensive industrial development was promoted largely with investment capital and favorable trade conditions for most of the former colonial powers. In state economic policies in post-independent Sri Lanka, it is possible to see a pattern reflecting the shifts and changes in the dominant former colonial powers as noted above. With marginal differences such as short periods of emphasizing development of the country's own resources for industrial development, which took place in Sri Lanka in the 1960s, Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it was then called, Sri Lanka has found itself increasingly absorbed into the capitalist economic system in which the momentum is towards an expanding and integrating global economy. In the past 2 decades, the objective has been to intensify the utilization of labor and resources to attract foreign capital into the country with the aim of boosting economic development of the country and meeting the goal of being a fully developed nation. Women's labor appears to have been critical to the selection of technology as exemplified by the extensive spread of free trade zones or export development zones in countries from East to South Asia. When Sri Lanka received independence from the British in 1948, it was recognized as a fully sovereign national polity. The Ceylonese at that time, the Ceylonese nation, had the sovereign power to adopt its policies and to realize the full potential of its society and territory. In other words, by the removal of the yoke of control by the colonial master, the country was empowered. However, the exercise of sovereignty within Sri Lankan society has meant a structure of hierarchized distribution of power with different degrees and types of power wielded by different segments of society, principally socio-economic class, caste, ethnicity, and gender. The development policies in the recent past have had a heavy focus on women's labor force participation. This focus has been accompanied by an identification of the female labor force primarily in terms of its gendered identity. Thus, most of the labor-intensive industries technologies were conceived with an identified source of supply, women. Now, today, the labor-intensive industries, which are placed highest in the measurement of gross national product, are the garment industry, the plantation industry began over a century ago, and remuneration from housemaids in West Asia. All these draw on women's labor. According to conventional definitions of economic activities and of the labor force, it appears that in Sri Lanka, women have played an increasingly significant role as contributors to the national economy and economic development since the country gained independence. recognition of women. Now, what I'm saying is women have played, but recognition of women as key participants in national development, however, emerged only in the 1970s with the emergence of the concept of women in development and the UN Declaration of Women's Decade following the First World Conference on Women in 1975. So, in this period, under the aegis of the UN, developing countries such as Sri Lanka were encouraged to initiate national development plans and programs which would ensure that the potential of women's labor contributions were drawn on. So we had the Women's Bureau set up in Sri Lanka in 1978 as part of the national machinery to promote policies and implement programs that would enhance the participation of women, which was categorized as economically active. In 1983, we had a Ministry of Women's Affairs was set up. The Ministry of Women's Affairs was from the beginning attached to another ministerial portfolio. It was Ministry of Highways, Transport and Women's Affairs, or it was Ministry of Health and Women's Affairs. In 1997, it was recognized in its own entity as the Ministry of Women's Affairs. In 1993, a women's charter was drawn up in Sri Lanka in line with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the fundamental UN document on the rights of women. The Women's Charter, although not legislated, remains the only policy document on women in Sri Lanka. So, to get back into the perspective of this new framework of recognizing women as being critical to the development process, despite the fact that there are sufficient historical records as women have always been part of economic production right throughout our history, women's productivity is recognized today primarily in terms of their involvement in the market. This means that as the country follows the project of development as defined by the dominant ideology of capitalism, the market becomes the central point in valuing labor and natural resources. An examination of the situation of women in the Sri Lankan economy, however, indicates that women are primarily distributed in the lower ranks of the labor market. In terms of wages, technological skill development, and social status, the majority of women are found to be in positions which exclude them from decision-making processes. These characteristics of the female workforce in the country then raises the question as to the nature and reality of women's empowerment within the development process. Now, according to the definitions of economic activities and labor force participation that is used in Sri Lanka, it is clear that women's labor force participation is increasing, and the increase is very significant. It has been rising over the last 3 decades, particularly among the age group 20 to 45 in comparison to that of men. This rise in women's participation in the labor force can be directly linked to the development policies of the state since the 1970s, when the shift came, as I mentioned before, to female labor-intensive industries. The number of women in the labor force has almost doubled in a little over a decade, from 1.6 million in 1981 to 2.3 million in 1996. In assessing the extent of economic empowerment of women, one needs to be aware that there is an assumption that changes have taken place in relation to the distribution of economic power between women and men over a period of time. Women's economic empowerment would essentially be evaluated in terms of an increase in women's ability to exercise their rights as economic contributors to the country, ability to articulate their needs, and to be recognized as those with increased potential and capacity as decision makers, both in the public as well as the private sphere. Now let's look at where women are actually in this context. Sri Lanka celebrated 50 years of independence last year. We are now 51 years of political sovereignty and power. In the 1990s, the female to male population ratio is more or less even. In the context where economic policies have focused on integrating women into the development process, an examination of where women are actually in the decision-making and political processes is useful to illustrate the linkages between development and women empowerment. Representation in the political arena is considered to be a key indicator of empowerment. Sri Lanka is famous for having the first woman prime minister in the world. In the last few years, we are one of the few countries where both the president and the prime minister are women. So we have the daughter as the president and the mother as the prime minister. However, these facts do not in any way indicate the reality of the marginalization of women in decision-making and political processes. According to the Department of Census and Statistics in 1997, the number of women parliamentary members in 1947 was 3 out of a total of 117, that is 2.6%. In 1994, it was 11 out of 222, it is 5%. After almost 50 years of political independence, the representation of women in politics remains largely insignificant. Similarly, in the Sri Lanka Administrative Service, the number of women in 1979 was 117, that's 7.6% out of a total of 1,545 members. In 1993, it was found to be 290 out of a total of 1,699 members, which was 17.1%. Similar, strikingly gender-differentiated characteristics can be seen in other areas, such as the distribution of women in the Sri Lanka Scientific Service and Sri Lanka Planning Service. The dearth of women in decision-making and political processes in the country can be linked to the prevailing political culture. Women who have achieved or accessed leadership positions in the country have often done so, it seems, under the shadow of male spouses, fathers, which is one of the things I think that link all our countries together. The first prime minister in the world achieved the position through the murder of her husband by somebody else, not by her. The current president of the country, while undoubtedly possessing the political acumen for eligibility to the position, remains, however, the daughter of an assassinated prime minister and the widow of a political activist. Most of the women who have reached other key positions within the political structure have had such close links to male political leaders. Actually, I think of the 5 women who are there in parliament today, I think 4 are widows where the husband was killed in political reprisals, etc. However, this is not to say that there are no women leaders in the country. Women's leadership is very much in evidence when one examines the vibrant women's organizations spread across the country, particularly in the rural areas. Women's leadership qualities are very much in evidence when one looks at political campaigns in times of elections, where women often form the backbone of house-to-house campaigning. The poor representation of women in decision-making positions within the political and civil administration can be firmly linked to the political party system which exists in the country. By and large, the system ignores or overlooks women's capacities as leaders in training and skill development for leadership. The focus is principally on men as leaders and women as followers. This can be seen in all political parties in the country. A glance at the membership of cadre of trade unions, especially those in the plantation sector, and the absence of women in decision-making levels of such organizations is yet another example. In the plantation sector, I don't know whether you're aware, most of you may be aware, maybe close to 90% of the workforce is female, but we never have heard a woman spokesperson on behalf of the plantation sector. The trade union is totally dominated by men. Of course, when we raise the issue with them, they tell us that there are women in leadership positions, but nobody has ever actually had the opportunity to meet any of them. When we talk to political parties and ask them why aren't there women in your leadership, in your parties in leadership positions, they tell us that it's because women don't like to come into these kinds of work. They are They don't like politics, they are very shy, they don't like to stay away from home, etc. When we linked it up to the number of women who are involved in campaigning, which means going from house to house, from village to village, down every street, they said, well, you all do something about it. That it's not actually, it's never been recognized, I think, amongst political parties, although in the last election they did include women in their manifestos because women's organizations pressurized them so much. Now we get into the manifestos, but not into the structure of decision making. The prevailing gender ideologies, gender identities of women and men as different social actors is based not only on biological differences, but on the socially constructed norms and behavior. For example, despite the fact that both men and women are capable of and even involved in reproductive activities such as childcare and housework, the prevailing ideology emphasizes that such activities are primarily, if not solely, the responsibility of women. The exclusion of domestic work from the definition of work is as only that which is considered economically productive raises the issue of the arbitrary nature of the values assigned to labor, in particular women's labor. So what I'm trying to do is I want to discuss the fact that where women are in the labor force and where they are, and the fact that they are actually confined to only certain sectors of the labor force, which again come under the lower wages, less skilled, and this comes from the prevailing notions that this is what women are capable of, and this is what actually is more designed for women's gendered roles. The gender division of labor, whereby socially ascribed characteristics dictate the capabilities of women and men, not only place women in positions of less economic power in the workplace, but also ignore the contributions to the reproduction of labor in the domestic field. Now, another example of how this is manifested is if we look into the health sector in Sri Lanka. The country can boast of an extensive system of accessible healthcare services covering the whole country until the advent of the war in the north and the east. Yet gender differentials in access to food between men and women is shown in the rate of low weight babies born in Sri Lanka. Now, in comparison with the other countries in South Asia, Sri Lanka shows high achievement rates in terms of health services, low infant mortality rates, low maternal mortality rates, but the percentage of infants with low birth weight in 1990 was the same as was found in Pakistan, where I understand the country has very low health indicators in general. So these examples then must necessarily point the discussion in the direction of understanding the ideological framework which situates women in these categories. Women's contribution to the home and to the domestic economy are not recognized as being economically valuable because it is considered to be women's duty or obligation as mother, wife, daughter, sister to perform such tasks. In this context, one has to examine also the culture-based constructions of gender as an indicator of the differential impact not only of social and economic development, but also of empowerment of women. While women's labor has been the backbone of the country's economy for many years, their concentration in the lower ranks of the gender-based division of labor has resulted in their access to decision-making and political processes being very limited. So in this context, where I have raised the issue of where women are placed within the economic structure and the ideological framework which informs their role, I would like to discuss with you the situation of women where there has been armed conflict, and I'm looking very specifically at the emergence of female-headed households. When I'm talking about armed conflict, I'm talking about the conflict that is continuing in the north and the east, and also the armed conflict that took place in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Female-headed households are emerging as an increasingly important constituency in Sri Lankan society and polity as we move towards the 21st century. At the national level, the proportion of female-headed households has been noted to have increased from 16% in 1981 to 19% in 1992 and 21% of all households in 1994. Combined with the general features of the situation of women within the socio-economic framework of the country, which I talked about earlier, the increase in the number of female-headed households is seen to have been the result of political upheavals in Sri Lanka, which the political upheavals that Sri Lanka has experienced in the form of social strife in the south of the country during the late 1980s and early 90s, and continues to experience in the ongoing war in the north and east. In effect, for over 2 decades, the population of the country has been subjected to large-scale displacement from village to refugee camp or from village to other village, and death and disappearances of family members. According to the Ministry of Shipping, Ports, Rehabilitation and Reconstruction, by the end of 1996, a total of 785,000 persons have been displaced, of which 75,000 are children under the age of 5. It has to be noted that most official statistics are not gender disaggregated, and the prevailing situation of conflict in the north and east has impeded the carrying out of a census of population in these areas for several decades. So all the census and statistics data that are used in Sri Lanka today have a sentence which says excluding the north and the east. So in fact, it doesn't really give the picture of what the situation is in the country as a whole. Some relief agencies such as Oxfam and Forut are reportedly initiating moves to gather gender disaggregated data of the refugee populations in the north and the east. And this was like last year, we still don't have very good information. Given that in the north and the east as well as in the south, military action has been primarily undertaken by males, be it in the government armed forces or militant groups, there is a general perception that approximately 60 to 70% of the displaced population in the country is female. Micro-studies also indicate that there is a significant number of young widows amongst the female heads of households which have emerged in recent years. For example, reports from the East indicate that due to the ongoing conflict, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 women have been widowed in the last 6 years, most of whom are living below the poverty line. For example, in Erabur Pattu TS division, which is one area in the East, there are 1,174 registered widows, most of whom are under the age of 40. Official information on female-headed households still continue to describe them as households with widows, vulnerable women, destitute women, and unsupported women. They don't call them female-headed households, thus generally overlooking the important distinction that what is being noted is in fact a relatively new and distinct social phenomenon with far-reaching implications for our society and economy. Micro-studies carried out in the north, east and south indicate that female-headed households are a significant proportion of this population. A study carried out in the southeast district of Konaragala, which witnessed much of the violence that took place in the south of the country in the late 1980s, found a large number of men had been killed or had disappeared during this period, and the population now comprised 59% female and 41% male in that district. The national average is 49% female and 51% male. While the overall population composition rate is basically 1-to-1, the implication of this study is that female-headed households are a relatively new phenomenon. The patriarchal social norms which prevail in Sri Lanka places higher social and economic value on men and perceive males as having more authority in decision making both within and outside the household, as I talked earlier. Consequently, the manifestation of these perceptions can be seen in the official, although technically unwritten, recognition of males as household heads, particularly in areas such as census data collection, access to loans, access to poverty alleviation benefits, access to land or housing ownership. The perception of male authority also pervades domestic relations, in which both women and men would first look to the adult males in the household for a decision, particularly in relation to the public sphere. The emergence of the phenomenon of female-headed households, which are in effect households with no adult male or males present, thus implies the need for a serious reappraisal of household composition in official policy approaches to households in general. A pioneering study of households affected by the ongoing war in the Northeast, done by a colleague of mine, Kumudini Samuel, found that there are several reasons for the emergence of female-headed households within the past 2 decades. She observes that women become heads of households due to the death of a spouse killed in action as a combatant, killed by either of the forces engaged in combat, or killed as a result of being caught in the crossfire, shelling, bombing, strafing, or in explosions. In most such instances, the body of the victim is available to the next of kin for burial or mourning rituals to be carried out. The second categorization of female-headed households that she has is the death of a spouse subsequent to arrest or abduction by either of the combatant forces, where the death can be verified through direct admission, eyewitness accounts, etc. She does this categorization because it's important when it comes to obtaining compensation from government, which I will talk about later. Another way in which a woman becomes head of a household is a spouse disappears with no eyewitness present, or a spouse has fled to escape harassment, arrest, detention, forced conscription, or death, his whereabouts known or unknown, or a spouse has abandoned his family to join a militant organization, or families have been separated in the course of flight and a spouse cannot be located. So she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways in which she says female-headed households have emerged in the situation of armed conflict. Although the types of situations cited above are by no means exhaustive, studies of the impact of armed conflict both in the north and east and in the south indicate that the situations described above are applicable across the country. The importance of noting the different situations through which women become heads of households is that it has implications for both personal and public sphere. In identifying needs and concerns of female-headed households in the situation of armed conflict, there are several key areas that should be considered. These areas can be categorized as broadly falling into 1, the emotional and personal needs of these women and their households, and 2, the recognition of their needs and concerns at the public level. At the same time, there will be instances where the public and personal situations may merge. At the personal level, the loss of a spouse and or son is in itself an event of great sadness in any circumstances, and a sudden loss additionally causes shock. The loss of such an individual or individuals in the context of a socio-cultural milieu which sets high value on men and enforces a dependence on men has a particular impact on women who suddenly find themselves in situations of being the main decision maker and economic provider for their families. This is often a role for which women are psychologically ill-prepared. Often the circumstances in which these changes occur do not leave women sufficient social space or time to articulate their grief or concern, which in turn impact on their ability to build up their own strength and capacities. This has been found to be common in the case of women who have been displaced or are in refugee camps. Such situations have also been found in studies that have been conducted in southern villages which had been subject to armed conflict. Another impact on female-headed households in this situation is that of, another concern is that of trauma. When the death of such a person has been witnessed by other family members, where the death of such a person has been witnessed by other family members, inevitably this brings out even more grief through vivid memories of the suffering which the victims suffered. This is very applicable to what's happening in the north and the east, and was extremely evident in what happened in the south, where people just came and dragged somebody out of the house and, shot them, beheaded them, tortured them, or whatever. The psychological needs of female heads of households remains an area to which there is little attention yet paid in most government-led assistance programs, whether in the war situation which prevails in the north and east, or in the case of the south. In recent years, a handful of NGOs have taken initiative to provide some facility for women to articulate their personal feelings as a means of coping with trauma. The Centre for Family Services, for example, runs a program which integrates the concept of helping women through theirs and their children's traumas with counseling to enable the acquisition of marketable skills for economic improvement of the household. Studies have also found that women who have become heads of households due to death, disappearance, or separation from their spouses in a situation of armed conflict are subject to social and sexual harassment from men of their own community or village, or any of the armed forces or groups. The social norms and behavior which prevail in the country result in the perception that of such lone women as being available for the sexual gratification of men. In this regard, it is also important to note that women who have been bereft of an authoritative and socially accepted male companion may seek various forms of companionship for purposes of both emotional and physical security. In some instances, men may move into the woman's household for short periods of time, sometimes in the event of the woman receiving any economic benefit through state assistance programs, and subsequently move out. In such situations, it is important that organizations and state agencies which work with or formulate programs to assist female-headed households recognize and address women's needs for companionship. They should work towards forming support networks which would empower these women and mitigate their vulnerability in such situations. Many of the women who have become heads of households in this context have been largely dependent on the income of their spouses for the survival of their household. With the sudden death or disappearance of the men, these women are overnight compelled to take on the added burden of being the main income contributor. Most of the women have little marketable skills and knowledge on how to embark on income earning activities, and thus often face immense hardship in finding the resources to maintain their family. Those who have been found to undertake food preparation and processing at home for sale, others who can find help for childcare become casual agricultural laborers, while still others end up mainly dependent on whatever state assistance they can obtain. Since enabling these female-headed households access to marketable skills and income-earning work within their specific abilities, as well as the social and cultural context, is of paramount importance in state policy regarding the welfare of these families. In the area of public concern, in the public sphere, the official recognition of the bereaved family's access to any beneficiary program initiated by the state requires a formal record as to whether the death of the spouse was witnessed by or admitted to by the perpetrator of the deed. Whether it was witnessed by anybody or whether somebody says, yes, we killed him. Where there has been no such record, the spouse or the spouse has disappeared in any of the situations that I talked about earlier. State policy in this regard does not allow for the newly formed female-headed household to benefit from such programs. This has serious implications for the survival of female-headed households, particularly in those areas most affected by armed conflict. That's why the state has formulated a program of assistance to families which have been affected by armed conflict. But they require that you have to prove that the man was killed or abducted or whatever. So you need to have either the armed forces or the militant groups admit that, or you need to have somebody else who has witnessed it. Where there are so many cases where neither of that is on record, then the women have a really difficult time trying to convince authorities to make it possible for them to access the resources. The government that came into power in 1994 has attempted to mitigate some of the problems that arise as a result of the lack of a death certificate of spouses who are unaccounted for as a result of armed conflict. This was done through the setting up of a commission on the disappeared, through which compensation could be claimed by the victims' families. Those families or women who had lost a family member in the situation of armed conflict, particularly within the last decade, are encouraged to send in details of the disappearance for consideration to the commission, which has now actually finished sitting, but it sat in different parts of the country over a period of about 2 years. While the hearings and subsequent decisions of the Commission have assisted a number of families, there are many women, especially those whose spouses or sons disappeared, who still find it difficult to accept the fact that they may be dead and wait in hope for them to return. Thus, they are reluctant to submit their cases to the Commission, as the act in itself is seen as their acceptance of the death of their loved ones. So there is also the third category, where there are women who don't want to go and say, yes, so-and-so disappeared, because they are still waiting in the hope that these people will come back. An important issue for female heads of households in such situations is the attention paid to their concerns and capabilities by the authorities who administer public services and institutions. Women living in refugee camps often find that they are neither consulted nor included in most decisions regarding their living conditions, their physical mobility, or the location of the resettlement. That resettlement meaning they move people, they close down refugee camps and they move people to what the state on the military decides is an area which is okay for resettlement. There is no consultation with the women. Such lapses are significant and has overall negative implications for the success of these activities and programs. For example, it has been found that despite women articulating to some degree their gender roles in society and repeatedly stressing the need for access to clean toilet facilities and cooking facilities in refugee camps, these needs tend to be disregarded in the course of operations, and particularly where they're moving large populations from one geographical location to another and settling them in places chosen by the authorities. Female heads of households which have emerged in this area of continued armed conflict, or where there has been armed conflict, often find the social framework within which these families have lived as male heads of households belonging to a community changes with either large numbers of persons moving or being moved to other geographical locations or camps, or as the community or village itself is unable to accept or relate to these households as new socio-political phenomena. So they are subjected to a lot of stress when they are being moved, and even if they are not being moved, there is a lot of social resistance even within those villages itself to accepting the household where the woman is now head of the household. The health needs and rights of women in these situations, whether in refugee camps or elsewhere, are rarely addressed by the authorities concerned in form of a coherent or systematic social policy. In the context of refugee camps, primary health care facilities are minimal, and women in these camps have often raised the issue of urgent action to cater to the needs of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth in terms of facilities and support programs. The concern of female-headed households in situations of armed conflict are many, and what I have tried to do is to set out some of these concerns, because what is important, I think, is to recognize that we can talk about female-headed households as a separate category. We can talk about women in the economy as a separate discourse. But in fact, the reality is that the same social norms, the same ideological framework applies both in the economic sector as well as to female-headed households. female-headed households, although they are close to 21% today of all households, still does not get the recognition in policy or socially as having rights by themselves, which is a really very problematic situation. Recently, I was in a discussion on this topic of female-headed households, and there was a very senior police officer there who had been invited by this government agency which organized this discussion, who claimed that we don't really need to talk about female-headed households because there are women who actually there's no man present. She pretends that she's going out to work in the day, but actually she's engaged in all kinds of other activities, hinting that she was in prostitution. And he just covered the entire spectrum of all the areas that were discussed by just dismissing these women. Because how are women alone, a lone woman in a household? This is how society perceives a woman, primarily. So I'll stop. Thank you.